They mocked his rifle, a cheap hunting gun with no scope, a weapon for farmers, not soldiers. But in the frozen hell of the Winter War, that toy turned into a nightmare, because in just 97 days, one silent Finnish farmer used that same no-scope rifle to eliminate 505 Soviet soldiers, and the Red Army still couldn't understand how. The Winter War began on November 30th, 1939, when the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive across the Finnish border. What followed was not a conventional battlefield, but a confrontation with one of the harshest environments on Earth. Northern Finland in winter was a world carved from ice-endless forests, frozen swamps, and waist-deep snow stretching across hundreds of kilometers. Temperatures fell so violently that even steel became brittle. On some days, the thermometer plunged below -40°C, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes and seize machinery that wasn't constantly kept warm. For the Red Army, this landscape was an unexpected enemy. Their units were built for broad, mechanized warfare tanks, trucks, and infantry columns designed to move quickly across open ground. But in Finland, every kilometer became a struggle. Engines refused to start, tank treads locked in place, oil thickened like glue. Soldiers not accustomed to Arctic conditions collapsed from frostbite. Before they ever saw the enemy, the forests amplified the danger. They were dense enough to swallow entire battalions and silent enough that movement could be heard. Long before shapes were visible, snowdrifts concealed natural depressions, frozen ponds, and treacherous slopes. Visibility often shrank to a few dozen meters, especially during heavy snowfall or the long polar nights. The Finnish terrain did not forgive mistakes, it punished them instantly. Despite this, Soviet high command was confident. They expected Finland's defense to crumble in 72 hours. The Red Army outnumbered the Finns by more than 10 to 1, possessed hundreds of tanks, and operated with overwhelming supplies. On paper, the war looked like a brief punitive action, swift, decisive, and guaranteed by sheer numerical power. But the calculations in Moscow didn't account for the battlefield itself. Finland's geography had a long history of breaking armies far stronger than its own. Local soldiers understood the terrain intimately. They moved on skis, traveled light, and blended into the landscape with white camouflage. Soviet units, by contrast, stood out against the snow and struggled to maneuver in forests where vehicles became useless. In these conditions, the environment became the great equalizer. Snow, ice, and darkness attacked without pause. Frostbitten hands couldn't fire rifles. Breath condensed into visible clouds, revealing positions. Even the sound of snapping branches carried farther in the frozen air. By the first week of fighting, it became clear that Finland was not just defending itself. The frozen wilderness, silent, merciless, and vast, was fighting alongside it. Simo Häyhä was born on December 17, 1905, in the rural parish of Rautervi, a small farming community near the Finnish-Russian border. His childhood was shaped by the land-vast forests, frozen lakes, and long winters that demanded precision, patience, and self-reliance. Like most Finnish farmers of the era, he grew up working outdoors from an early age, clearing fields, tending livestock, and hunting for food. These routines were not hobbies, they were necessities, and they forged habits that would later define his role on the battlefield. By the time he was a teenager, Simo was already an exceptional marksman. He hunted birds, hares, elk, and moose in dense forests where visibility was measured in meters, not kilometers. Every shot required calculation, wind direction, distance, snow depth, and the angle of moving prey. Missing meant losing food for the household. Hitting the target meant survival. These were skills learned long before he ever held a military rifle. Beyond accuracy, he learned silence. The Finnish wilderness rewarded those who respected it, who knew how to walk without breaking branches, how to breathe without fogging the air, how to disappear by standing perfectly still among the trees. Simo spent countless hours alone in the forest, developing an instinctive understanding of terrain, light, and movement. What sounded like solitude to others was, for him, a second home. When the Winter War began in late 1939, Simo reported for service like thousands of Finnish reservists. He arrived with no intention of becoming famous. He simply came to defend his homeland. The army issued him the standard M27 rifle with a telescopic sight, a weapon most soldiers preferred. But Simo refused it. He asked instead to use his personal rifle, a Finnish M2830 infantry rifle, with iron sights, the same platform he had used for hunting since youth. His reasons were practical. First, scopes sat higher on the rifle, forcing the shooter to raise his head, an unnecessary risk when every centimeter of exposure meant death. Second, glass optics reflected sunlight, revealing a sniper's position. Third, scopes fogged easily in severe cold. In temperatures approaching -40°C, a single breath could frost the lens instantly. For Simo, a rifle was not a symbol of modern warfare. It was a tool he understood intimately, one whose limitations and strengths he had mastered over decades of hunting. As he stepped into the opening battles of the Winter War, he carried not the most advanced weapon, but the one that aligned best with the land he knew. The contrast was stark, a quiet farmer entering one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. But it was precisely this simplicity, this rural discipline, and deep familiarity with nature that set the stage for what would soon become one of the most extraordinary chapters in military history. When Simo Häyhä arrived at the front, many soldiers found his choice unusual. A sniper without a scope was, in their eyes, a contradiction. The Winter War was already proving to be one of the coldest and most unforgiving conflicts in modern memory, and professional snipers, Soviet and Finnish alike, relied heavily on magnified optics to identify distant targets. For Simo to rely solely on iron sights seemed outdated, even reckless. But his reasoning was grounded in sober experience, not bravado. The Arctic environment punished technology in ways few armies were prepared for. Rifles fitted with telescopic sights became liabilities in extreme cold. Metal expanded and contracted unpredictably. Lenses fogged instantly when a soldier exhaled. Small amounts of snow melting on the glass could freeze into opaque frost. Scopes also caught the low winter sunlight, giving off brief flashes visible from great distances, something Soviet counter-snipers were trained to detect. These disadvantages were not theoretical. They were real hazards that had already cost lives. In contrast, Simo's iron sights had no glass, no moving parts, and no surface to reflect light. They functioned reliably at any temperature. Combined with his hunting experience, he could make accurate shots at distances most soldiers believed impossible without magnification. His techniques extended far beyond the choice of rifle. To hide the vapor from his breath visible in sub-zero temperatures, Simo kept snow in his mouth. While lying in position, the cold-packed snow cooled his exhalations, preventing clouds of steam from rising above his location. This simple adaptation made him nearly invisible to observers scanning the horizon for telltale movement. His firing positions were equally deliberate. Instead of building large, recognizable sniper nests, Simo preferred shallow depressions carved into the snow, barely large enough to hold his body. These micro-trenches blended seamlessly into the terrain. Before firing, he packed snow tightly around the muzzle of his rifle. This prevented the blast of escaping gas from kicking up loose powder, a giveaway that could reveal a sniper's exact position. In a conflict where Soviet artillery responded aggressively to any suspected sniper fire, eliminating visual signatures was essential. Simo's minimalist methods kept him alive. What seemed like outdated equipment was, in reality, part of a broader philosophy: simplicity as an advantage. Simo's skill did not come from technological superiority, but from mastery over fundamental stealth, patience, environmental awareness, and an intimate understanding of his surroundings. In the dense Finnish forests, where engagements often occurred within a few hundred meters, iron sights were not a handicap. They were a perfect match for the conditions. While others relied on doctrine and equipment manuals, Simo relied on instinct sharpened by decades of hunting in similar terrain. His approach demonstrated a profound truth often overlooked in modern warfare: understanding the environment can be more valuable than superior equipment. In the frozen forests of Finland, this principle was not theoretical. It was survival. Simo's no-scope rifle was not a disadvantage forced upon him. It was a conscious choice rooted in logic, shaped by experience, and proven in the most extreme conditions of war. Simo Häyhä's first weeks on the front marked the beginning of a pattern that would soon reshape the Soviet understanding of the war. Assigned to the Kollaa region, one of the most contested sections of the Finnish line, he moved quietly into position on the first days of December 1939. The landscape was a maze of frozen forests, narrow ridges, and snowfields broken only by clusters of pine and birch. Visibility changed by the hour, and temperatures plunged deep below freezing. It was terrain he knew instinctively, and he used it to his advantage from the very start. Within days, Finnish commanders began noticing something unusual. Whenever Soviet forces attempted small advances, probing attacks meant to test the line, they suffered precise, isolated casualties. A soldier would fall without warning, struck by a single well-placed shot. Moments later, another man would collapse from a direction no one could identify. Patrol leaders reported no muzzle flashes, no movement, and no visible positions in the forest. They simply noted that each time the enemy approached a particular sector, several men would not return. By the end of the first week, the pattern grew clearer. Simo's accuracy and timing stood out even among Finland's highly skilled ski troops and defensive marksmen. His shots were deliberate, always aimed at key targets: officers, machine gun crews, artillery observers. Finnish commanders, initially skeptical of the soft-spoken farmer with an iron-sighted rifle, began tracking the results. After the first 21 days, his confirmed count reached 37. For a single sniper operating under extreme conditions, the number was unprecedented. On the Soviet side, the early losses triggered confusion and frustration. Units advancing toward Finnish positions found themselves halted by an enemy they could not see. Soldiers reported being watched, followed, or targeted from impossible angles. Patrols entering forested areas sometimes returned in panic, convinced that multiple Finnish snipers were embedded in the area. In reality, most of the casualties came from one man. As Soviet infantry tried to adapt, fear spread quietly through the ranks. The Winter War had already introduced them to deadly cold and unforgiving terrain, but the presence of a sniper who seemed to strike without warning added a new dimension to their anxiety. Men whispered about an invisible shooter hiding in the snow. Some believed he was stationed in treetops. Others insisted he moved on skis faster than a patrol could track. No one could agree on his location, but all agreed on the same point: he was always there before they were. For Finnish troops positioned nearby, Simo's work created a psychological buffer. Enemy patrols approached more cautiously. Some halted altogether. Every distant rifle crack carried additional meaning. Over time, this contributed to the emerging legend around him. Soldiers began referring to him not by name, but simply as the sniper at Kollaa. Simo himself remained quiet and methodical. He moved positions frequently, studied wind patterns, and used the terrain exactly as he had in his years of hunting. Each engagement reinforced his reputation as someone who operated without error and unseen presence, who turned sections of the forest into zones of silent danger. In the first 21 days of combat, a farmer from Rotjärvi achieved what most trained snipers could not accomplish in entire deployments. The foundation of his wartime legacy was already in place: an enemy who feared him, commanders who relied on him, and a battlefield where his presence was felt long before it was understood. As December 1939 unfolded, Soviet commanders grew increasingly disturbed by the pattern emerging along the Kollaa front. Reports from multiple regiments described the same threat: a Finnish marksman who struck without warning, left no trace, and halted advances with unnerving precision. His kill count was rising far beyond what could be attributed to chance or luck. By the third week of fighting, Soviet intelligence concluded that the disruption in this sector was the work of a single man. They responded by dispatching a dedicated counter-sniper unit, 6 elite marksmen, trained specifically to hunt enemy sharpshooters. These men were not ordinary infantry. Several had combat experience from the Spanish Civil War and border conflicts in Mongolia. They carried scoped Mosin-Nagant rifles, the same model used by Soviet snipers across the front, fitted with optical sights designed for long-range engagements. Their camouflage differed from standard issue uniforms. They wore specialized white suits intended for winter warfare, allowing them to blend more effectively into the snow-covered terrain. Confident in their training and equipment, they were briefed on eliminating the Finnish sniper who had already claimed dozens of Soviet lives. They entered the Kollaa region with a clear mandate: locate, isolate, and neutralize their target. Yet the moment they stepped into the Finnish forest, they encountered conditions unlike any described in the manuals. Snow-muffled sound, branches absorbed light, and the cold froze exposed skin in seconds. Every movement sent flakes drifting down from the trees, marking their progress. Even for experienced snipers, the terrain was disorienting. Unbeknownst to them, Simo Häyhä had already taken a position before sunrise. He had spent hours shaping a shallow depression in the snow, packing it tightly to reduce movement and support his rifle. Snow had been packed around the muzzle to eliminate the burst of powder that typically accompanies a shot. His white uniform blended seamlessly with the frozen landscape. From only a short distance away, it would have been nearly impossible to distinguish him from the terrain. The Soviet team advanced cautiously, maintaining a spread and scanning continuously with binoculars and rifle scopes. Their formation reflected standard counter-sniper doctrine: scouts forward, shooters in the center, and a rear guard providing overwatch. Every 30 meters, they halted to search the tree line. They expected to encounter an opponent who used recognizable Soviet techniques. Instead, they entered the field of a marksman who operated by an entirely different logic. The first shot came from over 300 meters away. The team leader collapsed instantly, struck in the chest. The remaining snipers dropped to cover positions, attempting to determine the direction of the attack. Scopes swept across the snowfields, but no flash or silhouette appeared. Seconds later, another man fell hit while turning to reposition. Panic began to unsettle the formation. As they tried to maneuver, Simo fired again. A third sniper, attempting to dash between two trees, was struck mid-movement. Within less than a minute, half of the team had been killed. The survivors struggled to orient themselves in terrain that provided no clues. They returned fire at suspected positions, but each burst hit only empty snowbunks. The psychological impact was immediate. Soviet reports later described the event as a complete breakdown in confidence. The remaining snipers, highly trained and experienced, found themselves unable to counter an opponent they could neither locate nor predict. As they retreated, Simo adjusted his aim and eliminated the fourth man. The last two fled toward their lines, abandoning the mission. The destruction of the six-man counter-sniper team marked a turning point in Soviet perceptions of the Kollaa front. What had been dismissed as a troublesome marksman now appeared as a lethal, disciplined threat capable of dismantling elite units. Fear, once confined to whispers among infantry, now reached the ranks of trained professionals. The psychological collapse was not just among the men who faced Simo, but within the command structure attempting to understand how one farmer with an iron-sighted rifle had outmatched their most skilled hunters. In early January 1940, the fighting around Kollaa began to shift from a physical confrontation to a psychological one. Simo Häyhä's steadily rising kill count paired with his ability to remain unseen created an atmosphere of fear that spread through Soviet units faster than official reports. Soldiers entering the forested sectors near Kollaa began whispering about an invisible sniper who struck without warning and disappeared before anyone could locate him. They did not know his name, only the results of his presence: patrols that returned with fewer men, sentries found dead without a sound, officers collapsing mid-comment. These whispers gradually took shape into a single identity: a Finnish sniper the Soviets began calling Balaya Smrt, the White Death. It was a name born from observation rather than propaganda. The sniper wore white camouflage. He left no trace in the snow. His shots came with such precision and timing that soldiers described him not as a man, but as a force of nature embedded in the landscape. In a war already defined by brutal cold and unforgiving terrain, the idea of a human threat that seemed perfectly adapted to the environment added another layer of dread. Soviet commanders attempted to counter the problem through doctrine. They mapped suspected sniper locations, altered patrol routes, and ordered artillery strikes against areas believed to conceal Finnish marksmen. Yet none of these measures produced results. The snipers simply appeared in new sectors, demonstrating a mobility that defied their predictions. Officers began to understand that traditional tactics, flanking, suppression fire, massed infantry advances were ineffective against an opponent who refused to fight according to established rules. As losses mounted, the psychological strain intensified. Entire platoons began avoiding certain patches of forest after dusk. Even during daylight, troops hesitated to cross open ground or approach scattered tree lines. In Soviet field diaries recovered after the war, soldiers described the anxiety of patrolling near Kollaa. Some heard twigs snapping and froze, convinced the White Death was watching. Others fired into empty forests out of panic, revealing their own positions to Finnish defenders. The toll was not confined to the Soviet side. Finnish troops who fought alongside Simo admired his discipline and effectiveness, but they also witnessed the ordeal of constant sniper warfare. Maintaining silence for hours in temperatures that could freeze a rifle bolt demanded mental endurance. Any lapse in concentration could be fatal. While Simo remained composed, the relentless pressure of operating in such an environment affected everyone on the line. Still, Simo's impact extended far beyond tactical advantage. His presence altered the rhythm of the battlefield. Soviet advances slowed to a crawl. Units deployed additional reconnaissance teams that produced no meaningful breakthroughs. Commanders grew reluctant to send men into sectors where previous patrols had vanished with minimal evidence of combat. Fear itself became a defensive barrier, shaping movement and decision-making as effectively as fortifications or minefields. By mid-January, Simo Häyhä's reputation had outpaced the official estimates of his confirmed kills. The myth grew faster than the numbers. In the minds of Soviet soldiers, the White Death was not just a sniper. He was an unseen adversary whose precision made the frozen battlefield feel alive, watching, waiting, and striking without warning. By late December 1939, Soviet high command faced a problem they could no longer ignore. Regular infantry units had failed to silence the Finnish sniper at Kollaa. The 6-man counter-sniper team sent earlier had been eliminated almost instantly. Patrols refused to enter certain forest sectors without heavy reinforcement. Reports from frontline officers described a marksman who struck with impossible accuracy, left no trace, and disappeared before artillery could react. To address this threat, the Soviets turned to the NKVD. Commissar Ivan Volkov was among the most experienced sniper instructors in the Red Army's orbit. He had served in the Russian Civil War and later trained marksmen for Soviet operations abroad. Volkov had more than 100 confirmed kills from previous conflicts and had earned a reputation for discipline and methodical precision. When he arrived at the Kollaa front in late December, he approached the situation like a tactical puzzle rather than a battlefield anomaly. After reviewing intelligence reports and analyzing the pattern of Finnish sniper fire, Volkov concluded that the White Death, still unidentified by name, was not using standard Soviet or German sniper doctrine. Instead, he was adapting hunting techniques to military conditions: minimal exposure, unpredictable positioning, and careful control of environmental signatures. Volkov believed the solution was not brute force, but a layered trap that would force the Finnish sniper into revealing himself. He assembled 12 of the best snipers available in the sector, dividing them into 3 4-man teams. Each team would advance through a different approach route, with overlapping visibility. Their goal was not to kill Simo immediately, but to draw fire from him. The moment he fired, the other teams would triangulate his position and close in from multiple angles. It was a classic multi-team counter-sniper operation, a triangular engagement designed to overwhelm even the most skilled marksman. On the morning of December 29th, the operation began. One team advanced into a sector where Simo had been active in the previous days. Snow muted their movement, but the cold amplified silence in every direction. The men paused often, scanning tree lines and ridges with binoculars. Volkov observed from a concealed point farther back, waiting for the Finnish sniper to take the bait. Unseen by any of them, Simo Häyhä had already prepared a firing position hours earlier. He had carved a shallow nest into the snow, packed the front with hardened snow to suppress muzzle blast, and settled into a vantage point that offered a clear line of sight. He observed the Soviet team from more than 400 meters away. At 6:47 a.m., he took his first shot. The team leader collapsed instantly. Before the remaining men could react, a second shot hit the sniper on the far left. The third was fired moments later at a soldier diving for cover. The fourth was struck while attempting to sprint between trees on a downhill angle. In total, 4 experienced snipers armed with superior optics were killed in less than 20 seconds. Volkov realized immediately that his plan had failed. Instead of drawing fire and surrounding the Finnish marksmen, the first team had been neutralized before the others could even establish direction. The speed and precision of the shots indicated a mastery of timing that exceeded even elite training. Volkov ordered the remaining teams to hold position, but it was too late for recovery. Any attempt to pursue would expose them to the same threat. 2 days later, while attempting to analyze new patterns of sniper fire in a nearby sector, Volkov himself was struck and killed by a single rifle shot from over 400 meters away. His death confirmed what frontline soldiers had already come to believe. The Finnish sniper was not simply skilled, he operated beyond the predictability of military doctrine. With the loss of Volkov and 19 trained Soviet snipers within days, command concluded that traditional counter-sniper operations were no longer viable in Kollaa. The Finnish marksman's adaptability, environmental mastery, and unbroken survival forced a sobering realization: in this terrain, and under these conditions, he appeared effectively unkillable. In mid-February 1940, Soviet frustration at Kollaa reached its peak. Multiple sniper teams had failed, reconnaissance patrols were suffering steady losses, and the Finnish line remained intact despite overwhelming Soviet numbers. In an effort to break the deadlock, Soviet command authorized an extraordinary measure. An entire rifle company, more than 100 men, was ordered to sweep and clear a small forested sector, believed to contain the White Death. Their objective was singular. They were to find and kill one man. The assault began on February 17th, under conditions that seemed favorable to the Soviets. A thick morning fog settled over the forest, reducing visibility to barely 100 meters. This was the kind of weather that usually diminished the effectiveness of long-range marksmen. Soviet officers believed the fog would limit Simo Häyhä's ability to target from a distance and force him into closer engagement, where superior numbers could overwhelm him. But Simo had prepared for such a possibility. Days earlier, recognizing increased Soviet activity, he constructed not one firing position, but 3, each positioned roughly 50 to 70 meters apart. These shallow snow-covered depressions faced different approach routes, allowing him to strike from multiple angles without the Soviets realizing they were confronting a single shooter. Each position was precised for specific distances, accounting for wind patterns and terrain features. As the Soviet company advanced into the fog, the first shots rang out. A soldier fell near the front of the formation, then another beside him. The fog, meant to conceal Soviet movement, now amplified confusion. Officers shouted for the men to spread out, but visibility made coordination almost impossible. They returned fire toward suspected positions, yet each volley disappeared into the dense white air with no effect. Simo fired methodically. After a few minutes in his first position, he withdrew under the cover of fog to his second. From there, he struck soldiers who had taken cover behind fallen trees. When the Soviets attempted to flank what they believed was his location, he engaged them from the third position. The shifting angles of the shots gave the impression of multiple Finnish snipers operating in coordination. By the time the company began to retreat, unable to regain formation or suppress the unseen threat, 23 Soviet soldiers had been killed. It was one of the deadliest single engagements attributed to Simo during the war, accomplished through meticulous preparation, mastery of terrain, and calm execution under conditions that should have neutralized a marksman. The episode demonstrated the thin line between tactical brilliance and what some observers later described as near madness. Advancing alone against more than 100 enemy soldiers in a fog-covered forest was an act most would consider suicidal. Yet Simo's decisions were grounded in confidence in his skills, his knowledge of the land, and his ability to remain invisible even at close distances. On that day, the forest around Kollaa fell silent, not because fighting ceased, but because one man had turned the fog, the snow, and the terrain into weapons as effective as any rifle on the front. By early March 1940, the Winter War was entering its final and most desperate stage. The Soviet Union, having suffered heavy losses in the north, shifted to larger and more aggressive bombardments across the Kollaa front. The strategy was no longer to outmaneuver the Finnish defenders, but to overwhelm them with sheer firepower. Artillery units fired indiscriminately into forested sectors, targeting any area that might conceal Finnish positions. For soldiers on the ground, these bombardments were unpredictable and unavoidable. On March 6, 1940, Simo Häyhä was in one of his usual forward positions, a shallow snow trench near a frozen creek. He had taken his place before dawn, as he had done hundreds of times during the war. The air was still, and the sky clear, offering little warning when Soviet artillery opened fire. Shells exploded across the sector, some striking distant trees, others throwing bursts of snow and ice into the air. The bombardment was not aimed with precision. It was meant to pin down Finnish defenders and disrupt sniper activity. In the chaos of detonations, Simo continued scanning the terrain. He had survived barrages before by relying on quick relocation and the contours of the land. But this time, the threat did not come from artillery. Amid the explosions, Soviet infantry began firing explosive rounds, ammunition designed for anti-materiel use, capable of shattering equipment and splintering wooden cover. Though prohibited for use against personnel, such rounds were increasingly employed in the Winter War's brutal close-range exchanges. One of these bullets struck Simo in the face. The round exploded on impact, tearing away much of his lower jaw and cheek. The injury was catastrophic. Finnish soldiers nearby later recorded that the wound was so severe they struggled to recognize him. The force of the impact threw him backward, and for a moment, the battle around him faded into silence. Despite the severity of the injury, Simo did not die at the scene. Conscious but barely able to breathe, he began to crawl through the snow toward Finnish lines. The distance was short, but the effort required was immense. Blood stained the snow in a long, uneven trail as he pulled himself toward safety. His vision blurred, and the cold intensified the shock. Any soldier witnessing the wound would have assumed it to be fatal. Finnish troops eventually found him, collapsed and bleeding heavily. They carried him to a field medical station, where doctors assessed the injury with grim realism. The explosive round had destroyed bone and tissue beyond immediate repair. Medics believed he would not survive the night. Even if he did, they feared the trauma and blood loss would leave him in a vegetative state. There was little they could do except stabilize him and wait. Yet Simo lived. For 7 days, he remained unconscious as the war around him neared its end. On March 13th, the same day Finland signed the peace treaty ending the Winter War, Simo regained consciousness. His face was permanently disfigured, and recovery would take years. But he had survived a wound that should have killed him instantly. Among the many stories of endurance in the Winter War, few were as improbable as the survival of the man who had already changed the course of the conflict from behind an iron-sighted rifle. On March 13, 1940, as diplomats finalized the Moscow Peace Treaty that officially ended the Winter War, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes in a field hospital. He had been unconscious for 7 days, suspended between life and death after the explosive bullet that struck his face. The timing was extraordinary. The war that had defined the most intense period of his life ended on the very day he regained consciousness. He awoke to a Finland permanently changed and to a legacy that was already growing without him. In the weeks that followed, Finnish military officials documented the final numbers of the Winter War sniper operations. Simo's confirmed tally stood at 505 kills with a rifle, the most recorded by any sniper in history within such a brief period. Additional estimates credited him with around 200 more kills using the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun during close-quarters engagements. Even without the unofficial totals, his verified record alone placed him far beyond any contemporary marksman, establishing him as an unmatched figure in the history of military sniping. Yet the man behind the numbers rejected the notion of fame. After the war, Simo dedicated years to reconstructive surgeries and recovery. The injury had permanently disfigured his face and made speech difficult. Yet he carried no bitterness. When asked about his wartime actions, he consistently answered with the same simple phrase, "I did what I had to do." He never embellished his experiences or claimed heroism. Instead, he returned to a quiet life in the countryside, working as a farmer and later raising hunting dogs. The skills that had guided him through the forests of Kollaa once again became part of his daily routine. Simo's rifle, the M28-30 with iron sights that had become central to his wartime legend, was eventually preserved in the Finnish Military Museum. It remains displayed with a modest plaque noting his confirmed kill count and the weapon's role in the Winter War. Its simplicity contrasts sharply with modern sniper technology, yet it stands as a reminder that equipment alone does not determine mastery. Today, many of Simo's techniques, micro-positioning, vapor discipline, camouflage adapted to natural terrain, and silent movement, are studied in advanced sniper programs around the world. Though not always attributed to him directly, the principles he applied have influenced military doctrine in Finland and beyond. Simo Häyhä lived until 2002, long enough to see his reputation evolve from wartime necessity to global legend. His life stands as a testament to the power of understanding one's environment, trusting one's skills, and mastering simplicity. On the frozen battlefields of the Winter War, those qualities proved stronger than numbers, technology, or doctrine.